Now, just last week, on the 15th of September 2023, marked International Democracy Day. And on the eve of that, Chapter 1 Foundation, the Law Association of Zambia, as well as the GOtv, did hold a public forum to discuss the state of democracy in Zambia, where we now, and the way forward. Prominent in giving a keynote speaking address at that event was State Counsel John Sangwa, who is prominent constitutional lawyer. He's my guest on Costa tonight. State Counsel, it was a pleasure, and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
For the sake of those that might have missed, your comments and basically your keynote address on the eve of the International Democracy Day, we carried that, live. Quite a number of issues were touched on, and obviously depending on which side of the divide you are, people decided to pick what is good in their perspective. But briefly, just give us a summary in terms of the perspective of your address or your reflections on the eve of the International Democracy Day last week.
Okay. Yeah, the premise of the presentation was, it was a reflection in terms of where we've come from, the challenges we have experienced in the last 2 years, and also examining the prospects in terms of the future of our democracy. I think that was basically the focus of my my presentation, and some of the issues I highlighted were concerns in terms of expectations that were never met, because the outcome of the election of 2021 was not about continuity, it was about change. Now, the question is, if we changed, what kind of changes have happened in the last 2 years? And I accepted to participate in that discussion because this is effectively something like a midterm review of this government, because after this we go into the next 2 years. By 2025, end of 2025, I think the campaign will have started. So the rationale for my agreeing to attend was to try and give this analysis in the belief that once we highlight the shortcomings in the last 2 years, maybe we can do some corrections in the coming 2 years. That was basically the gist of my presentation.
I followed your presentation, and one of the key things you did was set the tone on trying to go back from probably the UNIP days, and you touched on the multi-party era of Frederick Schluer. And you made mention, because the audience, and I'll just stretch from the audience to the current population demography, we've got quite young people, and you spoke something about history being very key, and that if we do not understand history, we're bound to repeat the mistakes of history.
That's correct. That's what keeps me awake in the night, in the sense that I've been privileged to live through the time of Kenneth Kaunda, and most of the younger generation have absolutely no idea what it meant to live under Kaunda, and all what they know is what they read in books. But I lived through that, and I also had the privilege by 1991, when we were getting excited about multi-party democracy, I was already a graduate of from the University of Zambia, and I've been active follower of the events in the political events in the country. So the reason I pointed out is because I see similarities between the events of 1991 to 1996 and what is likely to happen between 2021 and 2026. There are frightening similarities in the sense that when you look at the position that Upnd is in, it's exactly the same position that MMD was in 96. The reason is that, you see, in 91, MMD took over a broken country, completely damaged country. If you go back, you check the statistics, you'll find that in 1964, Kaunda picked up a very healthy economy that was healthier than that of China on a per capita basis, healthier than any of the four Asian tiger economies that we talk about. And we were on a very strong footing. But because of certain policies, when we reflect back, certain policies did not help, to the point that instead of growing the economy, we actually damaged the economy, with the consequence that by the time we were now advocating for the return to multi-party democracy, the country had collapsed. You get a country which is healthy, no debt. By 1991, we owed, our external debt was about $7 billion. Fast forward 30 years later, we're in the same position, whereby PF, which is now in the position of UNIP, okay, gets an economy, which is perhaps, I think, when Arabi was in power, was basically, Arabi possibly had the best economy ever, because of the fact that we're going through the structural adjustment program, which was very painful, and the debts were forgiven. So by the time Arabi was leaving office, Zambia had a vibrant economy. Our debt levels, I think, was just about under 2 billion. But in 2008, when the debt was forgiven, our external debt was less than $1 billion. But of course, Arabi, I think, clocked a bit, something like $1 billion, an extra $1 billion, to bring it to about 1.9 billion. Within 10 years, we grew that debt. Count, at least it took him 27 years to grow 7 billion. But in this case, we took 10 years to grow the debt from about $1 billion or $2 to 15 billion. The economy is actually basically in a state of paralysis. It has collapsed. Now, these debts have to be paid. Now, the challenge is, how do you grow your economy and at the same time service the debts? You know, so UPND is exactly in the same position that MMD was in. MMD had no choice but to implement the IMF program. UPND also has no choice but to follow the IMF program, and then, but in this case, you are now talking about commercial lenders. So you have to deal with bilateral lenders as well. It is a far more complex arrangement now, but it doesn't change the fact that the country is deep in debt. Just
there, the quagmire, or obviously the dichotomy, comes in the scenario where we're discussing democracy. But a biting economy is at the heart of whether we will see democracy flourish, or decisions you make may either boot you out on poll day. And so it's a very tricky one. One of the things you tried to establish in your keynote address again is you picked on constitutionalism as the basis of what brings to life democracies, but you also went to weigh in constitutionalism versus party manifestos, because the parties run and they implement policy based on their manifesto, and you picked out articles of the Constitution and tried to marry what the UPND also promised.
Yes, I mean, there are challenges. I mean, nobody's going to diminish the challenge that the UPND has. But you see, for me, from my perspective, I think what is critical is being honest with the voters. Okay? If things are bad, just say it as it is. But when you try and sugarcoat and try to tell lies, and I mean, lies will catch up. Okay? But I have faith in the voters. You know, I warned President Lungu a couple of times to say, you know what, voters are very smart. Our voters are not stupid. They will understand. The most critical fact is that, you see, tell them the truth. Tell them how bad things are and why, what you're doing about it. And if you have challenges, explain why you have challenges. They will understand. But the problem is when you try and manufacture reality And that is where it becomes complicated. But unfortunately, when you manufacture reality, they will see it through because they're not idiots. They will see when they're being lied to. Now, for example, yes, I'll tell you, I was one of those who had very, very high expectations. I never thought in my wildest dream that things would get worse than they were under Lungu's time. But of course, the dynamics have changed. There are international factors at play. All what was required was for government to be able to explain these things. But of course, there are certain things that are self-inflicted by this government, which unfortunately have not helped them. At the end of the day, the reason why we emphasize on a democratic system of government is that a democratic system is accountable. There is no arbitrariness. The assumption is that when you have an idea, that idea is discussed and properly implemented. And policies are adopted that are in the interest of the country. And you embrace democracy because of the fact that you believe that there is openness, there is transparency, and so forth. But unfortunately, those factors are missing. And that is why the challenge that we face in Zambia is how best do we consolidate, not to destroy, not to abandon our democratic experiment, but how do we strengthen our democratic experiment? That is what we have to do.
Let's get into really breaking down some of the basic tenets that ferment, a solid democracy. And in the last 2 years, human rights has been one of those issues at play. The issue of the Prolonged Public Order Act and its reform is one another. Police brutality, and so on and so forth. But the president, even in his last address to Parliament just 2 weeks ago when he was opening the session, spoke about a functional three-tier system of the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. One of the things I noticed as well that you touched on were some of the decisions that are at play within the executive and the judiciary. And I just want to touch on the fact that every government that comes, you've been there longer, they always want to have a bite at this constitutional amendment. The Upnd promised us a restoration of rule of law and order. And significant when they sing for themselves is the abolition of the death, penalty and the defamation of the president. Is this enough for restoration of rule of law and order?
No, far from enough. It's far from addressing the challenges that we face, and it is far from consolidating our democracy. Very simple. I mean, the template was very clear. The reason why people voted for UPND was to make sure that they do the exact opposite of what PF did. It was basically asking to say, can you undo what PF has done in the last 10 years? That was basically the message. The question is, how much of that have they done? Okay? Of course, somebody can say, well, 2 years is too short. Now, others have argued to say, well, you can't judge a government in 2 years. What we are talking about is, given what we have seen in these 2 years, do we have hope for the future? Have they set the country on the right course to consolidating democracy? And my answer to that is no, they have not. Let's take, for example, the issue that you talked about, the Public Order Act. Now, it is clearly stated in the UPND manifesto that they will address that. In fact, it is clearly stated that officers that will abuse the Public Order Act, there will be some kind of sanction against them. And they promise a review. 2 years down the line, there is no review, and there is no indication of review. Not only is there no review, there is actually misapplication of the Public Order Act. Let me give you a few examples. When you read, when you talk about the Public Order Act, you get the impression that that particular act was only designed to address political parties. And yet, it applies to everybody, including churches. Now, when you are for rule of law, it means that you apply the law evenly, irrespective of who you are. Now, if we are to apply the law strictly, the way the Public Order Act stands right now, most of the churches will be required to get permission.
To congregate.
To congregate. Now, the reason for that is very simple. There is a provision in the Public Order Act which gives the minister a power to exempt certain church bodies from the application of the Public Order Act. But what has happened is that the minister only issued that order in 1967 and amended in 68 and exempted 12 church organizations. Now, from 68, can you imagine, from 68 to date, how many other churches have been created? All those other churches not appearing on that schedule are all expected to comply with the Public Order Act. Now, the question is that beneficial for our democracy? Is that what was intended? Now, if you are going to bar the political parties, why don't you apply the same to all the other churches? Because they're all subject to the same law.
But along the years, we've heard whether it's to completely repeal and replace or amend the Public Order Act. Even more recently, this year, we've seen police and others meeting, and the famous, obviously, judgments, whether it's in the Mulundika case, the resident doctors, whether it's in the Laz, cases. Why do we have mixed application or mixed, rather, interpretation of the Public Order Act? Is it based on political party color?
That is essentially what it is. Because, you see, when you're in the position, you cry about the Public Order Act. But when you're in government, you don't see you see actually the benefits of the act. But you see, that's not the way democracy is supposed to operate. Always remember that today you may be in the opposition, tomorrow you'll be in the ruling party, but you may also stop being a ruling party and go back into opposition. So you have to create an environment where you can function, whether as a ruling party or as a party in opposition. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen, But the biggest challenge we have is that the Public Order Act is used as a political tool, which should not be the case. And that was not what the intention was.
The arguments and the precedents set according to the Supreme Court ruling is that the police are not bound to give permission, but are supposed to be notified, and obviously some sort of security marshalling and so on. So on the civic rights aspect, on the constitutional freedom to assemble is where the biggest argument is, and the most recent examples being given are that of denying, for example, the opposition PF rallies, the former head of state, his right to assemble by congregating with others. So where do we draw the line between safety for your security and mine versus notification and providing, security?
You see, there is a problem in the Act, which is one really of application. When the Mulundika case occurred, there was this very emotional amendment of Section 5, where they removed the need for a permit, where you simply require a notification of the police. And the police, all what they can do is to give you conditions, stipulations that you have to meet. Okay? There is no requirement for a permit. You don't need a permit. All what you are required is to inform the police to say, okay, this is what is going to happen on this particular day. Then the police are expected to stipulate conditions. To say, okay, fine, make sure that you have your meeting, for example, from this time to this time. Make sure that the people that will speak, they prescribe. It's about prescription to ensure that, because they'll make a judgment. What is it that is required in order for this particular meeting to go without breaching peace? That is all what they are required to do. But unfortunately, what is now in their application, it looks like they are applying it in a manner that suggests that you need to get permission. Now, there is no such a provision. But there is a problem in Section 7, because Section 7 was not amended in 96. It still talks about a permit. And yet Section 5 doesn't require you to get a permit. Now, we're talking about 96. How many governments have we had in between? We've had a couple of governments, but none of them have cared to amend it. The only time they feel the pain is when they're in the opposition. But that's not the way to build democracy. You have to see yourself to say, okay, if I was on the receiving end, will I be happy with this? If you are not likely to be happy, then change it.
Others argue that in its current state, the POA is good enough. It's just being applied or interpreted. What is your take? Should we be completely doing away with it if we want to achieve freedoms and democracies according to the Constitution?
Yeah. If yes, we talk, first of all, I'm not saying that the rights guaranteed under the Constitution are absolute. They're not absolute. Okay, my enjoyment of my rights and freedoms are subject to the fact that I don't interfere with yours. And they're subject to the fact that I don't break, at the end of the day, I don't endanger public safety and so forth. Now, if there is a problem with the application, then why can't it be changed so that we cure that problem? Now, the interesting thing is this. People talk about these things. Yes, this government has talked about it. Previous governments have talked about it. But the point is, what are they doing about it? Okay? Now, there should be a penalty, like what was pointed out in the UPND manifesto, that if you abuse your powers under the Public Order Act, there has to be a penalty. But unfortunately, they have not enacted the law to impose such a penalty. And at the end of the day, you say something, but what happens on the ground is something totally different.
Allow me to move to something similar, just slightly away from the Public Order Act, but also interestingly to do with internal party politics and around just democracy in our politics. It's an interesting issue of the Constitution versus other subservient, pieces of legislation. From the time of the MMD, and I'll start there, when President Chiluba attempted to have a third term, he failed on that. He tried now to weigh in on the constitution of the party, the MMD then, that Mwanawasa was going to be president of the republic. He wanted to be president of the party. So it's the strength of the party that puts you into State House versus the power of the presidency. I'm giving this example because we have come up with some laws that when a president leaves State House, we entirely expect that president, he or she, to retire from so-called active, politics because they are on a payroll of taxpayers' money. So there's a very thin line when this individual walks into a supermarket or walks into a church, whether they're expressing their constitutional right to assemble, to express themselves, or they're playing active, politics. How do we expect former heads of state really to behave by law?
Well, the point is this. First of all, one of the things that we need to acknowledge is the fact that once you leave State House, you stop being president. You become a private citizen, like you and I. You have rights, okay? So you are perfectly at liberty to express your opinion on certain matters, like any other human being. But the complexity of the situation, again, the kind of stuff that we're seeing today, is something that happened between 91 and 96 with Kaunda. Kaunda stayed on as party president up to 93. Then he resigned. After that, then Kevin Sokotwane came in as party president. But Kaunda's retirement was very brief because in 95 he came back wanting to contest the election of 1996. But the problem that we have right now, we have this murky situation where people say, is President Lungu in active politics or not in active politics and so forth. So that is creating a bit of a problem. But if you have a proper democratic party, a party that is as internal democracy, the expectation is that when you lead your party to a defeat, what is expected of you is to resign from that political party and allow the party to elect a new leadership to be able to rebuild the party and then begin to prepare for the next election. But what is happening in the other political party, of course, is completely undemocratic because you cannot hold on to say, well, we're going to put an interim president and then you have all this chaos. It's not helping the party.
But legally, State Council,
yes.
My question is it by law that if I leave State House, I shouldn't participate in my political party affairs?
No.
Do we expect every former head of state then to do away with their political career?
No, we're not saying that. And the law is very clear because, for instance, in fact, we're talking about this in terms of the benefits that kick in. Okay, if you say you lose your position, you say you've been defeated as president, you have to make a decision. Are you still going to remain in active politics or not? Meaning that you are actively involved in the affairs of your political party and so forth, meaning that you are going to contest the leadership of your political party. Now, if you are still heavily involved and actively involved, then you have not retired. So the only thing that you lose in that case is that your benefits won't kick in.
So just there, what was the rationale then in coming up with such a law? I remember you gave an example last week of how we managed to sneak into our constitution in '96 the parentage clause to infringe on KK from coming back. And when you look world over, there have been presidents who have been to a defeat and have managed to bounce back. So what was the principle to make those that have been to State House stay away by threatening them to say, if you come back or you contest, we will remove your benefits?
No. If you look at that act, it wasn't actually passed during the MMD era. It was passed in the Counter era. Okay? Because when Counter realized that they were going to a multi-party system, they realized that there was a possibility of losing. But remember, Counter believed in this fact that as a leader, you are not required to have any business interest. They had what they call leadership code, which prevented you from doing certain activities. So they realized that all these years, the leaders were actually not catered for. Okay? So now what meant that is if they went into an election and they lost, what was going to happen is that these leaders were going to be destitute. And in fact, they were destitute. Because now what happened then was that the only law that MMD came and recognized was that which provided for an ex-president. If the other people, Secretary General, Prime Minister, all the other, in fact, there was even an earlier act which provided for all these leaders. That act was scrapped. So the only thing that remained was to provide for the president.
But from a constitutional perspective, I mean,
Yes.
these are conditions of what we call constitutional office bearers.
Yes.
I mean, the president, I don't know now about the vice president who's a running mate. I think it applies to judges, the Speaker of the National Assembly. These are very well catered for, that, houses will be built and they'll get certain kinds of retirement, benefits because of having served, public office. I'm just thinking, and I want to get your schooling on this. When we see other democracies like in the US, you have former presidents, Obama, appearing at the Democrats' rallies and supporting Biden's or other senators, but still getting state security and still getting the privileges. Former President Trump is recontesting, but still getting the privileges. How does it align in our situation?
Yeah. You see, they have their own laws in that respect. And ours are also very clear. They say the only time you draw those benefits is if you retire. That's what the law says.
And so how do we define retiring?
Well, if you're not actively involved in politics, okay, then again, one has to say, what does it mean to be not actively involved in politics? Then it becomes somewhat problematic. But I think it is something that requires correction so that the genesis of all these was Kaunda, because one time he said, I'm retiring from active politics. Then a year later, he comes back. The question is, when you come back and you are contesting, the issue is, do you still continue to enjoy state benefits or not? Okay? Now, ideally, one would say, yes. What you now need to do, one would say, yes, you continue to enjoy the benefits, but if you get elected, then those benefits should stop. That's another way of looking at it. But I think it is an issue that requires a national conversation on it so that we have a clear position on it.
One of the things still on this matter, and I want to get directly onto the issue surrounding former President Edgar Chagwa Lungu. when we talked about the Public Order Act, he wasn't in Dola 3 weeks ago and stopped from, congregating. Just last week again, we were told debates around whether he should go for a medical checkup or not. And there are these talks around whether he's back in active politics or he's just enjoying his constitutional freedom. One of the things you made mention there that has struck debate is whether or not, President Lungu is eligible or to come back and contest the election in 2026. One of the things you touched on listening to you is the fact that once courts make decisions, they become precedents. And during the PF time, this matter was taken to court and a ruling was given. There are others who are saying he's not eligible. School us on this again.
Yeah. You see, I mean, I've heard this back and forth on this particular point. You see, we have a constitution which says that any matter of interpretation of the constitution, if there is a dispute, you take it to the Constitutional Court. I can read the Constitution and come up with my own interpretation. You can read it. If we agree, there is no problem. But when we disagree, I have no right to impose my interpretation on you, and you have no right to impose your interpretation on me. The answer lies in either of us taking the matter to court so that the court can adjudicate on that issue. Now, I was one of those people that took a position that I interpreted the Constitution to mean that as long as you have been elected twice to the office of president, you are not eligible to go for a third possible election. Okay? Now, my argument was that it doesn't matter how long you served after your first election or even second election. The very fact that you've been sworn into that office the second time...
You've been elected twice.
You have been elected twice. That was the end of your political aspiration as president. That's it. Now, there was another school of thought which says, no, given the way the Constitution has been structured, if you have served less than 3 years, it doesn't amount to a term, therefore it doesn't count. And my argument to that is said, no, that provision did not exist in 2015 when Lungu took part in the election of 2015 to serve his first term. Therefore, the Constitution could not be applied retrospectively. We went to court, argued, and the Constitutional Court came on the other side and agreed that the first time he served, beginning in 2015, did not count. So therefore, his term...
Because it did not amount to a term.
It did not amount to a term. Because then effectively, his first term was from 2016 to 2021. Meaning, based on the interpretation of the Constitutional Court, or based on the interpretation of the Constitution by the Constitutional Court, it meant that Lungu only served one term. Now, having served one term, he was therefore eligible to stand in 2021. Now, nothing has changed since 2021 to stop him from contesting in 2026 if he wants to.
Just there, some Zambians are having a difficulty in understanding you and stomaching you. They're accusing you of changing goalposts or flip-flopping. Rightfully, like you've explained, that you were one of those that petitioned the eligibility of President Lungu then, and you've ably explained. So in your words last week, you said it is the duty of every citizen, yourself and everybody alike, to defend the Constitution and protect Edgar Lungu if he so wishes to stand.
That's correct. Yes. It's very simple. Now, I went to court and I lost. By virtue of the fact that I lost, it means that the court has provided clarity on the issue. Rule of law means accepting what the court says, even if you don't like it. Okay? You may not like it, but that's the law. Now, short of that, it becomes lawlessness. For us not to begin to say, I still don't agree with the Constitutional Court. No, the Constitutional Court is the final authority on the interpretation of the Constitution. They tell us what the Constitution means. Okay? So there is a final position. There is no room for appeal, and that particular decision has never been vacated, and that still remains. Now, having said that, as a defender of the Constitution, okay, I have no choice but to respect the decision of the Constitutional Court. My personal feelings have no role in this issue.
So based on that judgment, ECL is eligible to stand in 2026?
Yes, because he stood in 2020. You see, the Constitution bars you in terms of the number of times you occupy the office of president. It doesn't bar you in terms of the number of times you contest the election. Okay? So he contested in 2021, and nothing has changed to deprive him his eligibility to contest again. He can contest as many times as he wants, because the Constitutional Court has said he has only held the office of president once. Therefore, he's still entitled to his second shot. So he can go on until maybe he gives up himself.
The history you mentioned, and we've seen it again with some of the examples you've been giving tonight, that we have used either the Constitution or the courts to bar individuals from standing.
Yes.
What is the possibility of an appeal on this matter?
I mean, I would be surprised. It's something I wouldn't do. Okay? There may be other people who may take the view that the Constitutional Court was wrong. It's a possibility. They can go back, okay, and request the Constitutional Court to vacate its decision of 2021, which held that Lungu was eligible. People can still go back. Whether the Constitutional Court will agree with them or it will stick to its position is something that I don't know.
How common is it for a court to overturn its own judgment?
Very unlikely. Very unlikely. Very unlikely. There has to be very, very compelling reasons as to, you have to demonstrate why you think the initial decision was wrong. Okay? Because in this case, for example, in fact, it stems from an earlier decision that was made. In fact, I think, I can't just remember the time. The 2021 decision was based on the earlier decision. The court decided not to depart from its earlier decision and simply reaffirmed its position in the 2021 decision. And that's it. And I'll be very surprised if the Constitutional Court would vacate its decision where they held that Lungu was eligible.
Others, through a political lens, feel that obviously that Constitutional Court decision was made because the sitting judges then were appointees of the then administration, and we've seen many changes alike there. So are we worried that then our courts are making decisions on the basis of political lines? And not only in Zambia, we see this. I was watching the Roe versus Wade turnover, because when you look at the policies of the Republicans and the Democrats, it's like even the courts make decisions on the basis of
It's possible. It's possible because the president has also packed the court, by the way. Lungu packed the court with his own judges, and the president, Ichilema, has also packed the Constitutional Court with his own judges. But I don't know how that mixture, that concoction is going to play out in the real life. But I think it is worth it, those that are still legally energetic and very ambitious, to give it another shot and move the Constitutional Court to adjudicate on that matter. But for me, I would rather look at it to say it's a settled question, and then if let's say Lungu decides, it's entirely his prerogative. But remember, we are all bound by the decision of the Constitutional Court.
Let's take a bite at the aspect of corruption in line with the rule of law and democracy. Those in the opposition, especially the Patriotic Front, have cried foul that they're being persecuted. The former head of state himself has had his wife, his children arraigned before law enforcement agencies. In one of his statements, he says, they're peeling me like an onion. They're trying to get to me. But from a legal perspective, I know that in the amendment of the Constitution number 2 of 2016, there were some certain amendments made towards aspects of how immunity is lifted. One of the things you touched on was that, yes, a president or a former head of state may have immunity to being prosecuted, or you need to clear on that. But he has no immunity to being investigated because, according to you, it's the process of investigating first that needs to find one with a prima facie, case that leads then to moving a motion before the House that immunity be lifted. Let's delve into that.
Yeah, I mean, one has to go back into history. I mean, whatever that provision is, stemmed from the case we did in relation to Dr. Chiluba. Because what had happened in after 2001, President Mwanawasa went to the national, because investigation had not even been carried out. He went to the National Assembly and read this list of allegations of things that President Chiluba was alleged to have done whilst in the office. And on the basis of that, the National Assembly removed his immunity. Now, we went to court to say, no, you cannot do that. What you have to do is that before immunity is lifted, you have received one side of the story from the incumbent president. You have to allow the former president also to give you his version of the story.
The rules of natural justice.
That's right. And we argue that no, the rules of natural justice were never observed in relation to the lifting of the immunity of President Chiluba. But unfortunately, we lost that. There were several judgments that were made. But it turns out people were listening and they realized the unfairness of the situation, whereby they realized that prosecution can easily be used by an incumbent to fix his predecessor. So they had to provide safeguards based on the Chiluba experience. And one of the safeguards was that before you move the National Assembly to remove the immunity, there must be evidence to establish a prima facie case against the former president before you even actuate the National Assembly. Now, my point is that there is no way you can come up with prima facie evidence without investigation. Okay? So once you have that prima facie evidence, you now go to the National Assembly and say, this is the evidence we have against the former president. Now, the former president is equally entitled to appear before a committee of parliament to give his rebuttal to those allegations. And then the National Assembly has the benefits of both sides of the story, and then on the basis of that, it will make a decision whether to lift the immunity or not to lift the immunity. So it's a fair system that is now in place, which is not better than it was before 2016. So we have a far more robust system that is designed to protect the former president. And also, in Chiluba's time, what you needed was a simple majority. But now you need 2/3 of the National Assembly to vote, which unfortunately UPND doesn't have.
But why do we seemingly see different, commentaries out there in public? It's like the law is very clear, and for me though, if an investigation is made and the former head of state is found wanting, for me it even leaves no room whether UPND has the numbers or not, because a wrong is a wrong.
That's correct.
But what interests me is when it's like those in power are doing somebody a favor. Stop doing this, or else we'll lock you up. Why not just follow the law?
That is exactly one of the things that I was talking about. The point I was making, we have missed the opportunity to have President Lungu investigated. The problem is that if you initiate investigation now, those investigations will be tainted. Okay? They'll be saying, this is a witch hunt that is designed to prevent him from contesting the 2026 election, should he choose to. But if this process was initiated promptly, within 3 months of UPND being in government, that would have been a far more objective process. And then they would have come out in the open. We have investigated him. We have not found any evidence of wrongdoing against him. Or we said we have found evidence of wrongdoing against him. We are putting forward the motion. The president's obligation is simply to refer this evidence to the National Assembly. He has done his job. And then it is up to the National Assembly to make its decision. And you are right. As you have said, UPND need not have the numbers because it is an obligation of every member, even if you are independent or PF member, to be able to look at the evidence. This is where you forget your party affiliation and look at the evidence. does the evidence support the removal of the immunity? If it does, it doesn't matter. Whether you're a PF independent, you have to vote in favor of the removal of the immunity. That is how the system is designed to operate. The reason I highlighted this thing is the danger of using this system as a political weapon to eliminate a person from the race. Because it has happened before. From 1991 to 1996, what did President Chiluba do? First of all, when Kaunda came back, they threatened him to say, you will not stand because you are from Malawi. When he insisted, what did they do? They went and amended the Constitution to prevent him. That's why they introduced the parentage clause and also provided that as long as you have held the office twice, you're not eligible. So they removed Kaunda's opportunity to stand in the 2026 presidential election. 1996 election. So what I'm simply saying is that we need to learn from our mistakes in the past and make sure that what happened between 1991 and 1996 is not repeated between 2021 and 2026. And that is why I was saying that opportunity to investigate Lungu in a far more objective manner, that opportunity has been lost.
In the last 48 months, has the UPND missed out on delivering in accordance with their campaign promises? Again, I want to talk about the constitutionalism of things to bring about democracy. One other issue you touched on, for example, was the incident of how the court had moved in the Kwacha and Kabushi elections. You also touch on some of the president's comment being far below presidential, level of again, on the contesting, also warning alleged, coup plotters when you're the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Is it, again, what you said, too early on the job? Is this administration still learning, or are these mistakes just too far-reaching?
Well, I have a problem with them. Some of them, are, whether you are new on the job or not, those mistakes should not, things like that shouldn't happen. I mean, I have said I opposed what happened in Kwacha and Kabushi by-elections because everything was just orchestrated between the ruling party, ECZ, and the courts. In fact, the courts messed up the whole thing. You had a case before the Constitutional Court, another case before the Court of Appeal, another court before the High Court. Now, it was complete chaos because you only have one judiciary. What should have happened, the court should have come out very clearly, and we have this procedure. When you have multiple cases pending before court, to avoid confusion, you simply say, you know what, stop the process in this court, stop the process in this court. We just want to go with the process in one court. Therefore, the outcome in this case will affect all the other courts. That is what should have been done in a far more orderly fashion. But in this case, the judiciary failed us. Now, the reason why I take issue with this is that a democratic system cannot survive without an opposition party. An opposition party is a necessary evil for proper functioning of any democracy. The idea is that the opposition holds the ruling party to account. Now, you do not set out, once you're in power, to destroy the opposition. You can't, because that is undemocratic in itself. And in fact, you have to, because remember, today you're in opposition, tomorrow you'll be the ruling party. That is the vibrancy of any democratic system. And what happened in Kwacha and Kabushi just eroded everything in line with those principles. It was just like proper racketeering in terms of seizing these particular two seats. And the outcome actually undermined our commitment to democracy. So what is required is to be able to, you don't need to destroy the opposition. We need the opposition. That is what is important. Now, one of the things that we should be proud of as Zambians is that we have never had a dominant party. Now, by a dominant party, I'm talking about countries like Botswana, where you have had one political party since 1966. Where you have the same in in Namibia, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Zimbabwe. You have had one dominant political party. But we have been fortunate in the sense that we have changed political parties in the process. And that is the beauty of democracy. You see, because then we know that in our case, elections have consequences, okay? Elections have effect, not whereby somebody will just say, this election is a sham, where the outcome is already known. Here, we have to be proud of that. And that is something that we need to protect. We have to prevent the possibility of an emerging dominant political party. Because once you have a dominant political party, what you have then is that there is no inter-party competition for power. Then the power is fought within that political party. And that does not favor democracy.
Let's take this issue of good governance, the fight against corruption, and persecution of political opponents. How do we rate in the last 2 years this issue of a clique of thieves and bringing back, stolen assets, the introduction of, fast-track courts on, corruption? We saw such a rigorous fight again under Mwanawasa. Do we seem to win the fight in a legal and democratic fashion?
Well, I mean, I have no hope in the fight against corruption, okay? Because I believe that I think the start was very bad. Now, when you start on a campaign like that and you're a new government, what you do is that you put a team of your best guys in the country, your best brains in the country, people that already have experience in prosecuting cases of investigating and prosecuting cases of corruption. You don't start to reinvent the wheel. We already have experience stemming back to the time of 2021 with the President Chiluba, then President Arabi, and so forth. And one of my expectations was that if you ask me who would be the best person to lead a fight against corruption, I would say my good friend Mtembo Nchito. If he was in charge of that fight, I'll sleep comfortably. The reason for that is that he already has the experience in that regard. And he has done a lot of work far better than possibly anyone in this country in terms of the fight against corruption. But when you leave out a person like that, you do not even bring him in a consultancy basis. I mean, for me, that's when I knew that this fight is not going anywhere, because what you're trying to do, instead of building on your existing experience, you're now trying to reinvent the wheel. I have a problem with the way the cases of corruption are being handled. Now, the president is on record as having said, don't rush into arresting, investigate first, which is correct. But what is happening on the ground? We tend to celebrate arrests. What you should be celebrating, if you have to, is a conviction, not arrest. But even the way the whole process is being undertaken, I do not agree with it in the sense that, for example, if you charge me of an offense, why don't you release me or give me a police bond? Why? Okay? Now, why do I have to sleep in cells for 2-3 days? Why? Okay? Now, it looks like people just get that satisfaction. Now, remember the law says, I'm innocent until proven guilty. I have dealt with previous cases, for example. You know what? We had prosecutors, for example, who would say, listen, we need your client on such and such a day, on such and such a time. We're going to arrest your client. Bring sureties. Now, that's the way it's supposed to be. You go there, your client is arrested, he's read his rights, is arrested, and then you have the sureties, and then you come back with your client. But unfortunately, that is not what is happening, you know. So there is a problem in terms of the way this whole corruption fight is being undertaken. We are 2 years into this fight. How many people have been convicted?
Do we see this as an affront to the aspects of human rights? And then again, it's seemingly like only politicians are corrupt, and again, these constitutional freedoms and civic rights that we talk about, unfortunately, for Zambia, it seems they're only the preserve of politicians.
Well, that is one of the issues that I have a problem with. For example, just to backtrack a little bit, we seem to have established this trend that the corrupt politicians are only prosecuted when they leave office. Now, that's a bad precedent, okay? We started this precedent during Monawasa's time, where people, ministers, and Chiluba himself was prosecuted after he left office. Now, the same thing happened with Arabi, okay? The same thing is happening now. Now, they are being prosecuted by the same Anti-Corruption Commission. But that same institution existed long before. Were they not aware of these crimes being committed? Now, those are some of the challenges you have. Now, we have another challenge, for example. 2 years in this administration, how many ministers, or let's talk about ministers. How many ministers have been arrested and prosecuted for corruption in the last 2 years? None. So are we saying that corruption has ended with this particular administration? Okay. Now, obviously, this is not something that you can just wipe out overnight. Now, what is supposed to happen is that between corruption that is happening now and the corruption that happened before, the most destructive form of corruption is what is happening now.
The president keeps on saying they will prosecute corruption in the past, in the present, and into the future.
Yes, but the corruption that is critical is what is happening now. The reason is that what is happening now is undermining any effort to rebuild the country. Now, the damage done to the economy with past corruption is already done, okay? But what the most harmful is what is happening now, because whatever you're trying to do is being undermined by the current corruption. So if, in terms of priority, I would say the president should focus on the current corruption, not in the past corruption. And corruption in the past should just be some kind of salvage operation, really, to recover whatever needs to be recovered.
In the last, 1 month, the country was awash with this big scandal and headline of the Kenneth Kaunda International Airport gold scandal transaction involving whether it's $5.6 million. We're being told it was more than that. Does that give you room for worry as a seasoned, lawyer? There's been so much commentary around, this case that it had to, high authorities needed to be involved and how foreigners have been treated. What is your perspective on such a matter happening under a government which is observing the rule of law?
Well, ordinarily, if you have a properly functioning government and laws are being respected, an incident like that should not have happened in the first place. Because the essence of the law is basically to prevent the wrongs from happening. And when they happen, then there should be the relevant punitive measures being undertaken. Now, unfortunately, it happened. But even in the midst of all these things, you still have contradictory stories, which is not good for the country. But of course, somebody may argue to say, well, we can't comment because the matter is still in court and so forth. Yes, maybe on that account. But ordinarily, we hope at some point we'll get a clearer picture. But those are not good signs. So what it means then is that, there is need to revamp law enforcement agencies. And also, I think, from an administrative point of view, how you manage these things so that, you can't have public officers contradicting one another. So you just have one source of information. If you must explain, then come out with a clear-cut position, which is clear, and then you stick to that particular version. When you have so many versions, then it undermines the credibility of whatever is going to happen, whether outside courts or even within courts.
As we conclude State Council, the big question then, as we reflect on the International Day of Democracy, with all that we've analyzed, is our democracy growing?
Unfortunately, no. I would love to believe that we could have done better in the last 2 years. And like I said, I'm not saying that we can, like what the president has said, well, don't expect me to fix the damage of the last 10 years in 2 years. Nobody's saying that. What is just required is to be able to give confidence that we're on the right path to resolving the problems that we have encountered in the past. Now, of course, the damage done to both the economy and to the country in the last 10 years are significant, may not be fixed in a short term. But what is required is for people to have hope that things will get better. At the end of the day, the whole essence of having a democratic system of government is that with it comes prosperity in terms of the economy and everything else. But at the end of the day, I'm not seeing that, those possibilities. And I think on the economy, I have my own misgivings, and I would love to believe that I think we could have done better. I think what we need to accept is this. The responsibility to build Zambia economically and otherwise is the responsibility of Zambians. That is first and foremost. But what concerns me is the emphasis placed on foreign investment. Now, foreign investment is good, but again, how do you know when it's going to come and when it's not going to come? What do you do as a country if you don't attract foreign investment? I think the focus should be to say we will develop the country with or without foreign investment. Now, it's very sad when you read, I was reading a story which says, resource-rich but dirt-ridden Zambia. Now, that is not a very fancy description. How can you be resource-rich and so be deep in debt? There is a dysfunction there. I think that is what we need to address. Now, for those in government, they owe it to the people to explain exactly what is happening, and where there are shortcomings, explain why those shortcomings exist. But ultimately, foreign investment will never develop this country. And we've been on this path for the last 30 years, okay? From the time of Chiluba liberalizing and everything else, nothing has happened in terms of moving the country forward. I would like to believe that the key to developing this country is the Zambians. We have to seize that responsibility to invest, to grow our own economy, and not, if the foreign investment comes in, well and good, but if it doesn't come in, we should still be able to soldier on. And that requires a collective effort as a country, because no single person has the answer to all the economic challenges that the country faces. It is a collective responsibility for all of us as Zambians to be able to take part in resolving the economic challenges that the country faces.
Are there any positive boxes that the Upnd have ticked in terms of enhancing democracy in the last 2 years? You know, let me say it this way. When I was teaching, right, I was never known to be generous with grades. Okay, I really, and I've continued to be that. I'm not one who is generous with grades and accolades. No, if you are to ask me in all honesty, I would say we should be given both the international and the local goodwill that the government had in 2021. I think we should be in a better place than we are in today. So they have failed?
If you ask me to grade, yes, I would give them an F.
As far as democracy and the economic performance?
That's right.
State Council John Sangwa, always a pleasure, and thank you so much for talking to us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
For those of you that were following us on Diamond TV Zambia's Facebook as well as YouTube, it's channel 271 across the Southern African region. It's in Zimbabwe, Malawi, Botswana, as well as Namibia, channel 20 on GOtv. My guest, State Council John Sangwa. We've been discussing Zambia's state of democracy under the New Dawn government. Thank you so much. Good night.